Hey, folks. Happy Thanksgiving Day. I know most people are going to be doing other stuff now, but for those of us who had some time, I thought I might think of something that was a little bit maybe unusual to do for Thanksgiving. There were a lot of options, but I started to think, I talk a lot about how Thanksgiving didn't really start with the Pilgrims in 1621, but then I talk about how it did start. But, I thought maybe it would be fun for people actually to hear about those documents and what we do know about the Pilgrims and what was really going on around Plymouth Plantation in the 1620s. So I pulled out some documents to take a look at and thought I would read to you some of what we know and what we can tell from it. So as you know, there was a meal between the Native Americans and the Pilgrims in 1621. And we know about that because of a document called Mort's Relation. And I will tell you more about that in a minute. But here's what they say in Mort's Relation about that Thanksgiving feast. They say, "Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that we might that so we might after a special manner rejoice together after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. They four in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help beside, served the company almost a week. At which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms," that's guns, "many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest their greatest king Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation," that's the place where they were planting things, the settlement, "and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God, we are so far from want that we often wish you were partakers of our plenty." It's a message home to England. And it's an interesting document here because that's it. That's all they say about that moment. And it gets forgotten until this Mort's Relation gets discovered again in the 1840s, 1841. And when that happens, if you think about what was going on in the United States at that time, there's increasing tension between the North and the South. And this woman who runs Godey's Ladies Book, her name is Sarah Josepha Hale, starts to say, well, if Americans could just have a fancy meal together again to remind themselves of the fact they share so many blessings, they too could get along like the Wampanoags and the Englishmen did in 1621. So that's when we first get this idea of the Pilgrims and the Native Americans having this meal that Sarah Josepha Hale is later going to make a big deal of. Thanksgiving happens, it's something different. And then if I get to it, I'll tell you how we get a certain kind of meal associated with Thanksgiving. But I wanted to go back to the other things we know about the Pilgrims because I'm sorry, the Pilgrims, because the image we have of the Pilgrims often gets tangled up with the Puritans, and they're really, really different people. So the Pilgrims are separatists. They want to separate from the Church of England because they think it is corrupt. So unlike the Puritans, who are non-separatists, they want to stay within the church and purify it from within, and someday I'll tell you about them. The Pilgrims want to separate from the church. But the king wants no part of people who want to separate from the Church of England. So they are persecuted in England. And as you probably know, they leave England and go first to Amsterdam and then to Leiden in the Netherlands to be able to practice their religion in peace. And they tend to be small farmers, small shopkeepers. They're not terribly powerful people, but they run into a problem in Leiden, especially because their children are falling away from the faith. Their parents care so much about their faith that they actually leave England because they are so determined to have a different kind of relationship with God than they can have under the Church of England. And they go out of their way to move to the Netherlands and to settle there. And that's a a real trading area, lots of people coming and going, a real focus on trade, a real focus on getting along with different people, different languages, and so on. And the children start to fall away from their parents' beliefs. And so the parents, who care deeply about their children's religious upbringing, decide that they're going to try and put their children in such a position that they're going to be under pressure to turn to God again. So what are you going to do in, the 16 teens to really make people uncomfortable? You're going to go to Virginia, because in Virginia, after it's settled in 1607, Jamestown, people are dropping over there like flies. The life is terrible down there. So they figure if they go to a really nasty place, they're going to be able to bring their children back along into the faith. So they get permission to settle in Virginia. Not where they end up in what is now Massachusetts. They expected to be much closer to Jamestown than they were, but the ship, the mariners take the ship further north than they ought to have. So they leave England on the Mayflower on September 16th, 1620. There's 101 passengers, 87 of them are separatists. The Mayflower goes off course and it lands in New England on November 11th in Provincetown. And they if you've been to Cape Cod, I mean, it's very beautiful. We think of it now that way, but it's pretty bleak in the fall. In the late fall. And although it was not going to be a bad winter, they were sort of horrified at what they found. William Bradford, who was the leader of the Pilgrims, said, being thus past the vast ocean and a sea of troubles before in their preparation, as may be remembered by that which went before, they had now no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain or refresh their weather-beaten bodies, no houses, or much less towns to repair to. For summer being done, all things stand upon them with a weather-beaten face, and the whole country full of woods and thickets represented a savage hue. If they looked behind them, there was the mighty ocean which they had passed, and was now as a main bar and gulf to separate them from all the civil parts of the world. Now, while they were at anchor in Plymouth, William Bradford's wife, Dorothy, went overboard. How she ended up overboard is unclear. I always understood that she felt she simply couldn't face life in that country. She left her child behind, and that she decided she would rather try a watery grave than otherwise. But I said that to somebody who was a reenactor, and they said, oh, we always thought he pushed her. I have no idea, but he lost his wife, Dorothy, in that fall. But I want to go back to Mort's relation and what's going on with that, because for all that we focus on the Pilgrims in the 1620s, in the sort of beginning era of New England, in fact, there's something very interesting in Mort's relation I pulled for you. So they end up on Cape Cod. They don't expect to be there. And they recognize really quickly that the land is almost park-like. It's the trees are all sort of, there's not a lot of underbrush, and there's lots of grass, and it looks like this really, really inviting land. And there don't seem to be very many people on it. All right. So they start to look around there on Cape Cod to see what they're getting into and to see where they should settle. And this is one of my favorite pieces of Mort's relation. And I'm going to explain to you what this book does in a minute. When we had marched 5 or 6 miles into the woods and could find no signs of any people, we returned again another way. And as we came into the plain ground, we found a place like a grave, but it was much bigger and longer than any we had yet seen. It was also covered with boards. So as we mused what it should be and resolved to dig it up. Okay, so first of all, my students are always shocked by that, because in fact, they are in a new land and they're essentially digging up graves, which, if you think about it, they would never have done in France, for example. They're clearly thinking about the people who live in this land in a different way than they thought about Europeans, a different negative way. But listen to this. And resolved to dig it up, where we found first a mat, and under that a fair bow, and there another mat, and under that a board about 3/4 long, finely carved and painted, with 3 tines or brooches on the top like a crown. Also, between the mats, we found bowls, trays, dishes, and such like trinkets. At length, we came to a fair new mat, and under that, two bundles, the one bigger, the one less. We opened the grater and found in it a great quantity of fine and perfect red powder, and in it the bones and skull of a man. The skull had fine yellow hair still on it, and some of the flesh unconsumed. There was bound up with it a knife, a pack needle, and two or three old iron things. It was bound up in a sailor's canvas cassock and a pair of cloth breeches. The red powder was a kind of embalmment and yielded a strong but not offensive smell. It was as fine as any flour. We opened the less bundle likewise and found of the same powder in it and the bones and head of a little child. All right, what's going on with that? They just dug up a grave in an indigenous encampment and they found a blonde guy in it. A blonde guy who has a pack needle and who has sailors' things bound up with him, along with a child. And they don't really know quite what to make of who this person is, but it says a lot about what was going on in what is now the New England area, and of course into Canada as well, before the Pilgrims arrived. Let's look at another piece from Mort's Relation. This is another account of something else going on with them. While we were busied hereabout, we were interrupted again, for there presented himself, and they use the very offensive word, a savage, which caused an alarm. He very boldly came all alone and along the houses straight to the rendezvous, where we intercepted him, not suffering him to go in, as undoubtedly he would out of his boldness. He saluted us in English and bade us welcome, for he had learned some broken English among the Englishmen that came to fish at Monhegan, and knew by name most of the captains, commanders, and masters that usually came. He was a man free in speech, so far as he could express his mind, and of a seemly carriage. We questioned him of many things. He was the first person we could meet and talk to. There's using slang and old expressions there. He said he was not of these parts, but he had been here 8 months, it lying hence a day's sail with a great wind and 5 days by land. And then he goes on to say, he told us the place we now live is called Patuxet, and that about 4 years ago, all the inhabitants died of an extraordinary plague. And there is neither man, woman, nor child remaining, as indeed we have found none, so there is none to hinder our possession or to lay claim unto it. All right, so Mort's Relation is a document that was written in 1622 to send back to England to convince people in England, first of all, that what was happening in Plymouth was really profitable because they had borrowed a lot of money to come to Virginia, to come to Plymouth Plantation, what they thought was going to be Virginia. And they needed to convince their investors that they were going to be able to pay it back. They also wanted to convince other people to come and join them, because in the first winter, 1620 to 1621, half of the people who came over on the Mayflower died. So they needed more people to come really quickly. And one of the things that, if you look at Mort's Relation, which is widely available online, you will see it's sort of a catalog of all the different saleable products that they have found in New England, but and what comes to be known as New England. But what you see here is the sign that, in fact, the Pilgrims were not the first English people in on the North American continent. So what on earth is going up with that? Well, the clue there is both in the blonde man in the ground and with this Indigenous American who comes and says, "Welcome, Englishmen." That is a man named Samoset, and he actually comes from the area around Pemaquid, Maine, and he has met Englishmen who have been in that area and out on the island Monhegan, which is about 10 miles off the coast of Pemaquid, to fish, to dry their fish. All right, so let's move back another step. The area around Monhegan and all the way down into Cape Cod clearly has been pretty well traveled by fishermen. And I'm going to come to that. I'm going to move back to the fishermen in just a second. But because the fishermen started to come over to New England, you also got explorers who heard the tales that they told about the lands that they saw in what is now Maine, that in the early 1600s, you get a visit here by George Weymouth. George Weymouth comes down the coast of Maine, and one of the things that he is blown away by are the giant white pines that they see. They are first growth pines. They are old growth pines. They are big and huge and tall and straight. And he cannot believe what he has found because England needs masts. Remember, England is the country that has this phenomenal navy, but it doesn't have its own pines for masts any longer. They actually have to get their masts from the area around I think it's the area around the Ural Mountains is where they've been getting their masts in this period. And they're not very tall anymore. They have to be lashed together. They have to use two pines and lash them together. And of course, it's very hard for them to get their pines from over there. So especially if there's any kind of a war. So the idea that they might be able to sail to this land and get these pines is such a big deal that what we know of in New England as the white pine is still known in England as the Weymouth pine, because he's the guy who comes over and says, heavens, look at these pines. We're going to be able to have some pretty amazing masts from these pines. But now moving back, one of the things that we tend not to talk a lot about in American history is the extraordinary importance, both in American and English and Scandinavian history and Dutch history, of the fisheries. So the 1500s, in especially the North Sea, becomes just a sort of a free-for-all of people fishing for herring and for other fish as well in the North Sea. But there come to be so many people fishing there in the 1500s that the British tend to get kind of squeezed out. And as they get squeezed out of the North Sea fisheries, I always think of them sort of as like the seeds coming out of a lemon if you squeeze it, they begin to push further and further into the Atlantic. And as they push into the North Atlantic, into that incredibly rough land, what do they find? If you look at a globe and you look at where the North Sea is, and then you move into the North Atlantic, they end up pushing further and further into the North Atlantic, and they come across the Grand Banks. The Grand Banks are a really interesting geological feature because they're a place where the cold Labrador current comes down from the north, and the warm the trade current. I'm sorry, I can't think of the name of it right now. I'm actually recording this pretty late at night. I'm pretty tired. The warm current goes up along the coast of New England up into Canada, and those two currents coming together, the cold from the north and the warm from the south, mean that they mix together. And as they mix together along the Grand Banks, Newfoundland, and the coast of Maine, they create some of the richest water in the world. It's some of the most nutrient-rich water in the world. And there is also, because of the peculiar geology of this area, the ground in this area, you also have quite a long continental shelf. That is, rather than things dropping off very quickly off the coast, they actually go, the ground is pretty high up under the water for a long way out into the Gulf of Maine and further north. And what that means is this incredibly rich water and good ground cover for ground fish, like the cod that are in the Grand Banks. And by the way, for lobsters. This is why lobsters really are the central product of this area and I think there's 27 different kinds of lobsters around the world, but the one that everybody thinks of is the lobster that lives here off the coast of Maine. But those two currents coming together over the Grand Banks create extraordinary fishing at a time when you have what historians call the fishing revolution in the 1500s. And it's actually not a huge hop over from the North Sea and England over to Newfoundland and down into, well, Plymouth and the area that's going to be New England. So what starts to happen is that British sailors especially begin to leave England and come over to the Grand Banks off Newfoundland, and then come over to the coastline of what is now Maine to dry the catch, because they dry the cod in order to salt it and take it back to England. And they do so on big flat stone areas that they fillet the cod and then they dry them. So as they did that in Monhegan and then to some degree in Pemaquid, they began to get to know the indigenous Americans that were here. And crucially, when Weymouth comes over, and he's not a fisherman, he's an explorer. When Weymouth comes over, he actually kidnaps 5 guys and takes them back to England, which doesn't make for good relations anywhere along the coast, because everybody hears about that. And they want no part of these English guys who are going to kidnap them and take them who knows where on these big ships. But a number of them actually come back after that. But so there is this mixing of the English on this continent with the indigenous Americans who live here before the Pilgrims get here. And this is how you get Samoset, for example, who knows the names of the captains who come and knows the mariners and is accustomed to them. But crucially, you also see in Samoset's account, or in Mort's Relations account of Samoset, him saying this epidemic went through here and no one is left alive. Everybody is dead. That's what happened when Europeans made contact with indigenous Americans, because indigenous Americans did not have immunity to all of the diseases that came from Europe. So they didn't have immunity to a lot of the diseases that nowadays we are pretty accustomed to. So this was a lot harder to teach before the coronavirus pandemic, because we were what we call a virgin soil population when that epidemic hit. And we lost, more than 1 million people in the United States alone because we had no immunities to it. Now, of course, we've had vaccines and many of us have had the disease and we are becoming more accustomed to it. But imagine a population that does not have immunities to smallpox, to influenza, to measles, to mumps, to rubella, to chickenpox, to, all these diseases that that were endemic in Europe, but that didn't exist on the North American or South American continents. And worse, imagine if though you got them all at once. So nowadays, for example, if you get one of these diseases, what doctors do is they take care of you and try and isolate you and try and give your body space to heal. They didn't have that kind of space. These diseases came all at once. And because they were unaccustomed to them, they went like wildfire through these villages. And heartbreakingly, if everybody got sick in the winter, for example, people would be too sick to get to get wood to build fires, and they wouldn't be able to feed each other. They wouldn't be able to get water. And so what you see is by the time the Pilgrims arrive, the devastation for the indigenous communities because of these diseases is horrific, just absolutely horrific. And that does a number of things. That, first of all, dramatically changes the reaction of indigenous Americans to the arrival of Europeans, not only because they don't have the power that they need to fight those people off, but also because of the extraordinary sort of chaos in their societies. That is, there has been such a shock to indigenous societies that they're really kind of in chaos. You think about wiping out, say, 2/3 of the people in your population. What are you going to do to survive? How are you going to protect yourselves? How are you going to feed yourselves? Who's going to remember where the best hunting grounds are? Who's going to, where are your diplomats? Where are your war leaders? Where are your healers? Because you've lost a lot of those. And so they are looking in many instances, not necessarily as much in New England as in the middle part of the country, for example, but they're looking for, or in Virginia, they're looking for ways to stabilize their societies. And to some degree, especially in Jamestown, for example, the Europeans looked so weak that indigenous Americans were willing to make treaties with them or willing to work with them if it looked like it might help them stabilize their societies, either with trade goods or with firepower or simply with more people. So that's one thing that happens because of the extraordinary death rates that happen, again, before the Pilgrims come. But there's something else that you can see in the account of what I think of as the grave robbing. What you think of them looking in that grave and seeing all the things that had been left in that grave, and their comments that they had not seen anyone, there hadn't been anyone. And one of the things that does is it gives to the Pilgrims who arrive, and later European settlers as well, a sense that God has cleared the land for them. Remember, they're fervently religious, as are the Puritans who are going to come in 10 years. And they look around them at this land that indigenous Americans actually took quite good care of. They cultivated it in different ways than the Europeans would, but they burned. They knew how to fish, in pretty complicated ways with weirs, and they were actually quite active participants in taking care of the land. And they had done all that stuff, and they had really created a landscape that the Europeans found very attractive. And then they died because of these diseases. But of course, the Europeans don't know that. We don't get germ theory in the United States until the 1880s. So all they think is that God has prepared this land for them. And it means that they are somehow really, really special, coming from, a land it's in economic straits, coming from a land where, ordinary people couldn't have access to ownership of land. All of a sudden they come to this place and they find it just breathtakingly beautiful, cultivated, and there's nobody on it. It's one of the key reasons, maybe it's also part of their philosophy, that the settlers, especially in New England, begin to believe that they have a special mission from God, is because they are really not aware of the extent of the fishing that has taken place along the coastline and of the effect of the diseases on the indigenous Americans who live in this area. And then, of course, these diseases are going to spread all the way across the continent. But so what we get out of this moment of the Pilgrims, that later on gets remembered as this Thanksgiving feast because of the needs of the Americans in the 1840s, what we get instead really is both a sense of their own importance because they came at this particular moment, and the sense coming from them that America was God's chosen land because of the weird circumstances of the fisheries, the fishermen, the death rates that happened after that, their own desperate need, and the ways in which all those things came together to create that really unusual, maybe unprecedented moment. So anyway, that was like I say, I wish I were a little less tired as I'm doing this because I'm not sure I did it justice. But I always think about how when we were kids, anyway, in my age, everybody looked at Thanksgiving as being about the Pilgrims. And the Pilgrims really have very little to do with Thanksgiving. What they did have a lot to do with, though, is cultivating this idea that history really began with them. And it began with them in part because they were favored by God. And when you know a little bit more about the people who lived here before the Pilgrims and who came over here to exploit the fisheries as the world was doing in that time in the 1500s, it's a very different portrait of who the Pilgrims are and their role in what has become the way Americans think about themselves. All right. I hope that was interesting for those of you who were a little tired of just sitting around doing whatever everybody else was doing. I'm not sure. I will post this on Thanksgiving. I'm not sure we'll leave it up. If we'll see how people react to it. But if you were watching this, I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I'll be back on a regular schedule next week. But thought I should at least pop in and say hi on this Thanksgiving Day, 2025. Take care.